Welcome back to the Course Creation Incubator. I'm Gina Onativia, your course coach and digital strategist, and in today's episode, we're going meta. That's right, I'm recording a podcast all about podcast, because I think every serious course creator should have a podcast. And I can say that with full sincerity because I've had this podcast for about a year now, and I've seen the amazing things it's done for my business. And I want you to reap the benefits as well. I just did a podcast workshop for my 6-week accelerators, which got me excited about why I do this podcast and made me think about all the hard work the team has put into putting out a show each and every week. In this episode, I'll walk through why you should have a podcast, but more important, some questions you should ask yourself to make sure your podcast really works for you, your course, and your business. First, we're going to start with my favorite question. What is your outcome for having a podcast? When I started this podcast, I wanted to test the waters with a limited series. I wanted to see how I could connect with my audience in a new way. I also felt I have the bones to create one based on my years of working on Amy Porterfield's content. It was a gift working on her podcast because I got to see the behind the scenes and all of the layers that went into planning for a podcast. So it didn't feel like too much of a leap for me. Now, I'll tell you the truth. I didn't quite know what I was getting into when I was actually creating my own content. It's one thing to do outlines for Amy or someone else, and another to be responsible for the end result. There's a pressure there that I didn't understand, but I kind of like it now, and it forces me to learn how to be on more often and to practice my content. It also forced me to really learn my voice, figure out who I wanted to be as an expert, and I'll be honest, that's an evolving process, but this podcast has really helped me with that. All right, so that's admittedly a bit of a tangent. Here are a few of my whys behind the podcast, behind the incubator. One, I was feeling burnt out on my typical weekly content, which was my Facebook Lives at the time, and I was looking for a different format to share my expertise. Secondly, I wanted a way to drive more traffic to my website. And third, I thought I could try it out and see how it went. So that's why I started out with that limited series to test out the concept. And then, of course, I fell in love and I'm here with you today. For you, a few of the whys behind podcasting may be connecting with your audience week to week and building that audience. Podcasting is a fantastic list building opportunity. You have your opt-in front and center. You can offer list building freebies. And just think about it. In 2018, 44% of Americans 12 or older had listened to a podcast, compared to 57% in 2021. 116 million people listen to a podcast monthly. That's a lot of people for you to engage. Podcasting is also great for collaborations since you can offer a reciprocal relationship where you show up on someone else's podcast and they come on yours. That's another great way to build your business. Those collaborations expose you to a new audience, and those collaborations can help you build connections in your industry, which bonus may pay off somewhere in the long run in one way or another. Podcasts are also great to establish your expertise. Sharing your knowledge week to week so you're creating consistent content, and you know how much I encourage you to do that. It can be very powerful. Here's another reason. Students buy off of podcasts. 54% of podcast consumers say they are more likely to consider the brands they hear advertised on podcasts. That's according to Edison Research. Have I convinced you yet? If so, let's talk through how to make sure you can stand out. Because there are about 4 million total podcasts registered around the world. However, stats show that 59% of podcasts, at least on Apple Podcasts, are currently active, which means they've released a new episode in the past 90 days. So that means that 4 million number, take it down to 755,000. That's how many active podcasts are on Apple Podcasts as of June 2021, which means there's room for you to shine. Especially when about half of those podcasts are all true crime ones. All right, that's not a legit stat, but it seems to be like there's a lot of true crime podcasts. Now, when it comes to starting your own podcast, there's a set of 5 questions I want you to think about after you've considered your core outcome for your business. Think of this as your 5-point pregame for your podcast. So before you start scripting or recording or publishing, you want to ask the questions: who is your core audience? What's your unique message? What's the conversation? What's the mission? And why should they care? Let's go one by one. Who is your core audience? Now, more than likely, it's your course audience, right? It's your corner, your swimming pool, not your ocean. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, go back to the beginning of this series and check out episode 2. With so many podcasts out there, you want to start with a passionate base and grow it from there. For me, I get a lot of course creators, but I also have some listeners just looking for digital strategy. Now, as I continue into year 2 of this podcast, I'm definitely going to focus more on digital strategy podcasts along with the course creation and marketing. Second question, what's your unique message? Again, it's just like with your course. What's your special take? For me, I'm here to help course creators get across the finish line. You may teach a simplified approach to plant-based eating. That's from my accelerator grad, Diane. Or talk about how governments can take a better path to project management, and that's for Sandy. Just like you have a unique message for your course, you want to have something unique for your podcast. Next question, what's the conversation? I love that quote from the show Mad Men. If you don't like what's being said, change the conversation. The idea that you and we dictate the conversation. It's your podcast. You want the conversation to go like you want it to go. How do you want it to flow? For this pod, here's my convo for you. You want to define your own path. It's not one size fits all when it comes to course creation. And overall, anyone can be a course creator. I try to keep the conversation positive. The cynical New Yorker turned rosy California that I've become. That's on brand for me. Fourth question, what's the mission? Where do you want your listeners to go? I want you all to get across the finish line, like I've said. Now, I don't care if you're building a course, a workshop, a tropical retreat, or wherever you're sharing your expertise, I want to help get you there. Where do you want your listeners to go to take action on? Some of you may have a deeper mission to change the conversation that we're having about, say women in midlife or homeschooling or something else that maybe isn't talked about as much. I'm working on marketing this book right now about roaring into your next act. It's about changing the conversation around retiring at 65 and determining your next chapter. It is so good, and I can see a podcast all about it and all about its mission, changing the landscape of how we view retirement age. All right, let's get to that final question. Why should they care? What's the WIFM? What's in it for me? What are the benefits? For my podcast, I teach a simplified approach to course creation and different ways to market online courses and digital products. I want to build you up. I want you to listen to these episodes and go get your course done. And hopefully, if you care about course creation or digital marketing, you're going to care about this podcast. Think through the benefits you're bringing your listeners week to week to keep them coming back and wanting more. And make sure those benefits are clear. And make sure there's something that's in it for them, not just for you. Now, if you can answer all these questions, you're going to have a solid foundation for beginning your podcast. So let's get a little bit into the logistical aspect of things. I want you to think about how often you're going to release your podcast. Will it be weekly, twice a month, monthly? Will it be seasonal? Whatever it is, communicate to your listeners about what you're doing so you can build up a loyal fan base. Also, think about modeling success. What's a current podcast you like that you would like to model based on flow, how it's set up, maybe the questions I ask? My first intro to podcasts really was Amy's podcast. I like how she recorded her interview, then came back and recorded the intro and close. So I do that now with my own podcast. I've been on other podcasts where they have a set list of questions that they ask every guest, which I think is fun. I don't do that, but I like that format. Listen to your favorites, pick up on what you like and what you don't like about the way they record or present their show notes or market their episodes. And listen for different kinds of formats too. I do workshop episodes, rant episodes, coaching ones. I bring on guests and past students. I do a mix. What's the mix of formats that works for you? I think it's nice to have a mix, by the way, and change it up. And the marketing. Before I leave you, some notes on that. Think about the 80-20 rule. It's fun to record the episodes. I love the creative process, but you've got to work on marketing your podcast 80% of the time and then spend the other 20% of the time creating the actual content. For many of us, it might be the reverse, especially at first. But you want to be relentless when it comes to marketing and blasting your apps on all channels where you have a presence. You want to be sending a weekly email, letting your list and fans and everyone else know that you've got a new episode coming out. By the way, if you want some help with writing emails with impact, check out episode 25, which I did with Megan O'Leary. It's all about nurture emails. I'll link to it in the show notes. Then as a next step, you're going to set up all of these logistics pieces. Now, that's a bigger conversation for another episode. You'll want to think through how you're going to get your scripts done, how to write your show notes, how you'll end up publishing. And by the way, I love Libsyn for that. But the first step is to answer those questions I gave you at the beginning of this episode. That's where the real work begins. Then figure out your creative process and the logistics will follow. Let me know what podcasting questions you have after this episode. Drop me a line at Course Creation Boutique. I'll see you next week when I'll have more course creation tips and some digital strategy for you to chew on. Please rate and review this episode, especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, and then subscribe. Would love to get the word out about this podcast so you and I can help build up our course creator community. Until next week, go create, be you and be brilliant, and get it done.